Welcome to another quiet and drowsy chapter of boring history for sleep. Tonight, we drift not across waves, but across time, to a desert city where the nights were deep, the stars were sharp, and paper was more precious than gold. This is not a tale of kings or conquests, but of patient hands, and the soft rustle of parchment in the lamplight. In Timbuktu, a place of sand, trade, and hidden libraries, scribes once worked through the cool hours, sorting manuscripts not by titles, but by the constellations that wheeled slowly overhead. We will not hurry. The camels will walk at their own pace. The ink will dry as it chooses, and the stars, as they have for thousands of years, will keep their quiet watch. So, if you're ready, close your eyes, feel the dry warmth of the desert air. Imagine the scent of old leather bindings and ink, and let us begin with the scribes of Timbuktu and the starry nights that guided their work. The final time you step into the courtyard, the air feels different. A thin haze blurs the horizon, and the desert wind carries a cooler edge. The market stalls you passed on your way here were quieter, traders already speaking of the upcoming change in season. This is when the manuscripts tied to the end of the dry months come to the top of the piles. Tonight, Amadou is not alone when you arrive. A visiting scholar from across the Niger River sits beside him, a tall man in a white robe, his leather satchel bulging with pages. He has brought new manuscripts to exchange, part of the constant but understated traffic of knowledge through Timbuktu. Each arrival like this is an event, though there is no ceremony beyond a simple greeting, a pot of tea, and a slow unwrapping of cloth bundles. The visitors' manuscripts are spread on the table. Some are in impeccable script, others more hurried. One contains a list of medicinal recipes, each noting the season in which the herbs should be gathered. Another is a commentary on a local ruler's decree, marked with dates of astronomical events for reference, because here, dates are less about numbers and more about the position of the heavens. Amadou listens as the visiting scholar explains the origins of each piece. Every so often, he nods and gestures to an apprentice who quietly retrieves a corresponding manuscript from the shelves. When they find a matcha document already in the collection that overlaps with the new arrival, they place them side by side. This is when the scribes compare not only the content, but the marginal notes, the way certain letters are shaped, the color of the ink. These details are small, but they tell a story about who wrote the manuscript, where, and under what conditions. You watch as Amadou points to a line in one of the older manuscripts, and then to the same line in the visitor's copy. The difference is smaller, single word, altered. But to these men, that is enough to begin a conversation about why the change occurred. Was it a correction, a regional variation, or simply the habit of a particular scribe? The discussion drifts into other topics: the rhythm of the Niger's flood, the best wood for making pen shafts, the surprising scarcity of blue dye this season. It is in these apparently unremarkable exchanges that the life of Timbuktu's manuscript culture unfolds, knowledge passed along without urgency, yet with the weight of centuries behind it. When the visitor finally leaves, the courtyard falls into a quieter rhythm. Amadou calls over the youngest apprentice, a boy barely taller than the table. From a high shelf, he takes down another manuscript, this one wrapped in pale, sun-bleached cloth. This, he says, is the Kitab al-Hisab, the Book of Reckoning. It is not as rare as the Kitab al-Safar, but it too has its seasons. You expect astronomy or trade routes, but when the cloth is unwrapped, you find something else entirely. Long columns of numbers, carefully inked, and small diagrams showing arcs and angles. It is a treatise on calculating time and distance by the stars essential for travel. Yes, but also for determining when to bring certain manuscripts into use. You realize that these books are not merely records of knowledge, they are the tools by which all other knowledge in this courtyard is unlocked. The sorting by starry nights is not a metaphor. It is a precise science in its own right, one that combines mathematics, astronomy, and the lived experience of generations. Amadou allows you to handle one page. The paper is smooth but thick and faintly scented of the gum arabic used in the ink. He tells you that in his youth he spent a whole year learning to draw the small diagrams that map the moon's path through different constellations, work done not in haste, but as slowly as the moon itself moves. By the time the lamp burns, lo, again, you have begun to see the larger pattern. The stars mark the time. The manuscripts hold the knowledge for that time. The scribes are the keepers of both. There is no catalogue in the Western sense, no numbered shelves, no tidy alphabetical list. Instead, there is a living calendar written in the sky, and those who can read it will always know which bundle of parchment to open. Amadou replaces the Kitab al-Hisab on its shelf, high above the others, where the light does not fade the ink. The apprentices gather their pens, blow gently on their pages to dry the ink, and wrap their work in fresh cloth. You rise to leave, but you cannot help glancing up at the stars above the courtyard wall. They shine as they must have shone for hundreds of years, silently keeping time for anyone patient enough to watch. And so, the thought lingers as you walk back through the sleeping streets. How many other cities, in other corners of the world, once kept their knowledge not on numbered shelves, but in step with the slow, steady turning of the night sky. The next evening begins in much the same way as the last warm air cooling into a quiet breeze, shadows lengthening against the smooth mud walls, and the soft shuffle of feet along the narrow lanes. You return to the courtyard just after sunset, drawn by the same curiosity that had kept you awake the night before. Tonight, the stars appear earlier. The desert sky, so clear that it feels like a ceiling of glass, shows the faint glimmer of the Pleiades climbing above the horizon. Amadou is already there, seated at the low table. He has brought the small wooden chest closer to the lamplight. Timing, he says simply, as if you had asked a question, is not only about the calendar, but about how the sky speaks. The apprentices sit in a semicircle, each with their own reed pen and ink pot. On the table in front of them lie clean sheets of parchment. Their task tonight will be to copy from a manuscript that is not in regular circulation, one that emerges from the locked chest only when certain signs align. You sense that tonight might be such a moment. Before revealing the manuscript, Amadou gestures toward the horizon. The Tuareg call those stars the daughters of the night, he says, meaning the Pleiades. When they rise just before the moon, it is a sign for merchants and farmers alike. For merchants, it marks the time to prepare the camel trains for long journeys east. For farmers, it is a reminder to plant millet before the next rains. The connection to the manuscript becomes clear. Knowledge in Timbuktu is never purely academic. Every scrap of writing has a purpose, even if that purpose has shifted over centuries. The document in the chest is likely tied to these seasonal transitions, and Amadou's deliberate patience in revealing it suggests that even knowledge about planting times or caravan routes must be handled with care when the right moment arrives. Amadou unties the braided cord. He unfolds the deep indigo cloth slowly, almost ceremonially. Inside lies a sheaf of yellowed pages, the ink faded to a warm brown. Unlike most manuscripts here, the writing is not purely in Arabic script. Occasional annotations appear in Tamashek, the language of the Tuareg, written in a flowing, angular hand. This, Amadou says, is the Kitab al-Safar, the Book of Travel. It is older than my grandfather's grandfather. The text is a combination of travelogues, astronomical observations, and what you might call logistical poetry. One page lists the distances between wells along a caravan route, but instead of numbers alone, it compares them to the time it takes for the moon to move from one star to another. Another section records the angle of a shadow at a particular hour, but frames it as a proverb. A camel's patience is the shadow's length. Before the noon heat, you can see why this book is consulted sparingly. Its information is deeply tied to a world that moves at the speed of walking caravans, not rushing wheels. The routes, the distances, the landmarks, it is all still useful, but only to those who know how to interpret it. Amadou allows the apprentices to copy a single section tonight, no more. They work slowly, whispering now and then to clarify a shape of a letter or the meaning of a line. He explains to you that a full copy is never made in one sitting. Instead, the Kitab al-Safar is copied in stages over years, so that each generation of scribes encounters it at the right time, in the right season. It is, in its own quiet way, a system of apprenticeship through the stars. Knowledge is portioned out like careful rations for a long journey, never more than you can carry, never less than you need. By now the courtyard smells of lamp oil, parchment, and the faint temps of the tea boiling in a kettle nearby. The moon is higher now, its pale light brushing across the rooftops. Amadou closes the Kitab al-Safar again and locks it away. Not all who read it understand it, he says, and not all who understand it use it wisely. That is why the stars decide. It is difficult to resist asking what other secrets the book might contain. Are there forgotten routes that could be rediscovered? Notes on lost oases, old alliances recorded in the margins? But Amadou only smiles faintly and serves you tea, as if to say that the question matters more than the answer, at least for now. As you sip, you realize something else. The night sky is itself a kind of library here. The scribes do not just work under the stars, they work with them. Every arrangement of constellations is a heading, every phase of the moon a chapter. It is a system that could only be born in a place where darkness is not a barrier, but a companion. And so, as the apprentices quietly finish their pages and set them to dry, one thought remains. If the Kitab al-Safar is opened only at the right stars, what other manuscripts might be waiting for their own precise moment to return to the light? It is late evening in Timbuktu, sometime in the middle of the 15th century. The heat of the day has bled away into a gentle desert breeze, and the soft, red dust that coats the narrow streets now lies still. The muezzin's call has faded, the merchants have closed their awnings, and a quieter world emerges, one that belongs to scribes, scholars, and the quiet business of preserving knowledge. You stand at the threshold of a mud-walled courtyard. The air smells faintly of parchment and lamp oil. Inside, low wooden shelves line the walls, stacked not with bound books as you might imagine, but with neat piles of folded, handwritten manuscripts. Each is wrapped in cloth to protect it from dust and insects, and tied with a piece of dyed cord, sometimes red, sometimes blue, sometimes plain. This, you will learn, is not just decoration. It is part of an elaborate organizational system that the scribes of Timbuktu have been perfecting for decades. The man who greets you is Amadou, a senior scribe in the household of a well-known scholar. His robe is pale blue, and his turban is wrapped high, leaving only his eyes visible. He leads you to a low table, where a single oil lamp casts a small pool of light. Around it, 3 apprentices are quietly sorting fresh manuscripts, their hands moving slowly, deliberately, as if each page were something alive. People think we put them in order by subject, Amadou says in a low, measured tone, but that is only part of it. He gestures to the cloth wrappings and the cords. The stars tell us when a manuscript should be read, and that is when we put it on top of the pile. You will discover, over the coming hours, that this method, sorting by the lunar calendar, by the appearance of certain constellations, was not merely poetic. In Timbuktu's scholarly tradition, time and knowledge were intertwined. Some manuscripts were best studied when a certain star rose at dusk, because the topics within navigation, planting cycles, or religious commentary were linked to the rhythms of the year. The scholars knew the desert and the river as well as they knew their books, and their cataloging reflected that intimacy. The courtyard is quiet except for the scratch of a reed pen. An apprentice, no more than 14 years old, is copying a page from a centuries-old treatise on astronomy. You lean closer and see that the margins are filled with tiny notes, not just corrections, but observations like, "The star is later this year than last." These marginalia are as valuable as the text itself, a living record of how knowledge shifted with the sky. Amadou pours you a small cup of sweet mint tea, brewed so strong that it stains the rim of the cup. The manuscripts are never truly finished, he says. Each time a new copy is made, a little more of the present is stitched into the past. You imagine the work this represents. Hundreds of scribes, across decades, quietly adding their own marks to these documents. Some write in the margins, others choose a different color of ink for certain sections, signaling later readers to pay closer attention. The effect is less like reading a single book and more like joining an unending conversation. The manuscripts themselves cover almost every imaginable topic: trade routes along the Niger River, medicinal recipes for treating camel colds, legal contracts for salt caravans, poetic reflections on rain. Each pile has a logic that is not immediately apparent till you begin to recognize the cycles. The rain manuscripts are brought forward each year, just before the Sahel's short, wet season. The trade route records are consulted when the Harmattan winds begin, as traders plan their long journeys to the coast. It is easy to romanticize this kind of scholarship, but it was also a matter of survival. A missed planting date or an ill-timed caravan could mean loss of food, income, or even life. The careful matching of manuscripts to celestial events was as practical as it was scholarly. You picture a caravan leader arriving in Timbuktu, seeking the latest notes on a route he will take months later. The scribe, without hurrying, pulls out the correct manuscript, not from a numbered shelf, but from the pile that the stars have told him will soon be relevant. By now, the lamp oil is burning low. Amadou rises and moves to another table where a small wooden chest sits locked. He draws out a bundle wrapped in deep indigo cloth, tied with a braided cord. The apprentices watch as he loosens it, revealing a set of pages that are more brittle and faded than the rest. These, he says, are kept for certain nights only. You see, the moon must be high, and the Pleiades just rising. He does not explain why, at least, not yet. Instead, he carefully wraps the pages again and returns them to the chest. Knowledge can be like water in the desert, he says quietly. It must be given at the right time, or it disappears. You find yourself wondering what those pages contain. Are they about trade, astronomy, a long-forgotten poem? The night is deepening, the stars pricking into view above the courtyard. But Amadou has made it clear that this particular answer will not come quickly, and so you are left with a question. What manuscript could be so tied to the movement of the stars that it is only opened on certain nights? It is early morning in a small medieval village somewhere in northern Europe. The mist clings low to the fields, and the air is cool enough that your breath makes small clouds as you walk. Beyond the vegetable gardens and the rough timber fences, a narrow path winds toward a row of woven straw skeps beehives, shaped like upside-down baskets. You have been told that these belong to a beekeeper named Gerard, whose family has kept bees here for 3 generations. His yard is modest, a few hives, a small shed for tools, and an apple tree whose branches hang low with fruit. Yet to the villagers, his work is as important as that of the miller or the blacksmith. Bees do not only make honey, here they provide wax for candles, which in turn light the parish church and keep the long winter evenings bearable. Gerard greets you with the slow, deliberate movements of someone who understands that bees are watching. His hands are calloused, his tunic worn, smooth at the elbows. Over one shoulder hangs a small wicker basket for gathering combs. He does not wear the heavy veils you might expect. Instead, a light linen cloth covers his head, and he keeps his face calm, as though to remind the bees he is no threat. The hives are positioned with their small entrances facing southeast, catching the morning sun. This is deliberate. Bees, Gerard explains, rise with the warmth, and a hive that wakes early will gather more nectar before the air becomes too hot. In medieval beekeeping, every placement choice mattered, not only for honey yield, but to keep the bees from becoming restless and aggressive. You crouch beside one of the skepsi. The woven straw smells faintly sweet from years of honeycomb within. Gerard taps gently on the side with a small stick, listening to the hum. A steady sound is good, he says. Too quiet, and they may be sick. Too loud, and they are angry. In this age, without gloves or protective suits, the beekeeper's best defense was to avoid giving the bees a reason to sting. That meant working in certain weather too windy, never before sunrise, and never when storms threatened. Medieval manuals on husbandry even advised speaking softly near the hives, as sudden noises were thought to trouble their work. Gerard works slowly, lifting one hive at an angle to check its weight. A heavy hive means the combs are full. A light one means the bees may need more flowers nearby. He keeps a small garden of herbs, thyme, borage, and mint knot, only for the kitchen, but because bees favor them. The scent of these plants drifts across the yard, mixing with the faint beeswax aroma from the hives. The tools he uses are simple: a curved knife for cutting comb, a wooden spoon for scooping honey, and a thin puff of smoke from dried herbs when he must quiet the bees. The smoke does not harm them, rather, it encourages them to retreat deeper into the hive, distracted by the instinct to protect their stores. In a world without industrial hives, these methods kept the colonies intact year after year. As you watch, Gerard opens a hive to show a comb glistening in the morning light. The honey is thick, the color of amber. He points out the capped cells, each neatly sealed with wax, and the open cells where bees are still at work. A drone bee wanders across his hand, unbothered, yet his voice carries a note of warning. "Bees, remember," he says, "harm them once, and they will not forget." This is why he harvests honey only a few times a year, and never takes more than the bees can spare. In a good season, there is enough for the family, enough for the church candles, and enough to sell in the market. In a poor season, the bees are left with their stores untouched. Even here, in the quiet of the yard, you can sense the rhythm of life that governs his work. It is neither hurried nor idle. The bees move in patterns as old as the meadows they forage in, and the beekeeper moves in response, season after season, with as little disturbance as possible. As Gerard replaces the hive and steps back, he glances toward a darker corner of the yard, where a row of older skeps sits, half covered in moss. Those, he says, are not empty. They are for swarms, when the bees decide to leave home. You are about to ask how one convinces a swarm to settle in a new hive, but he only smiles faintly and walks toward the shed, as though to leave that for another day. And so you are left with the thought, what quiet art or ritual does a medieval beekeeper use to persuade a swarm to choose his yard over another? The answer, as it turns out, begins not in the yard, but in the meadow. A week later, Gerard leads you out beyond the village fields to a patch of wildflowers buzzing with activity. The air here is warmer, the scent heavier. You can hear the bees. Before you see them, their low hum like a thread pulled tight through the air. This, Gerard explains, is where a swarm may choose to settle on a low branch, perhaps, or in the hollow of an old tree. In the medieval world, capturing a swarm was part skill, part patience, and part ritual. Beekeepers often believed that bees responded not only to scents and spaces, but to sounds and even words. Gerard carries with him a small clay pot of herbs, thyme, sage, and a little fennel crushed and mixed with beeswax. This mixture, warmed between his hands, releases a scent meant to draw the bees toward him. When a swarm leaves its hive, it is following the queen to a temporary resting place before choosing a permanent home. Gerard's task is to offer them such a home, a clean, empty scap placed nearby, rubbed inside with a little honey and the herbal mixture. The skeps he showed you earlier, the moss-covered ones, have been seasoned in this way, waiting for such an opportunity. But scent is only half the work. As you stand in the meadow, Gerard produces a small wooden clapper, a simple pair of boards hinged together. He strikes them gently, producing a rhythmic tok-tok sound. In some regions, this was called tanging, and it was thought to calm the swarm, or at least signal to other villagers that a swarm was being claimed. Whether the sound truly influenced the bees is hard to say, but tradition held strong. He also speaks softly as he approaches the branch where a cluster of bees hangs, a living mass that shifts and ripples with movement. The words are not magic, merely a steady stream of speech reassurance for himself as much as for the bees. Medieval beekeepers often quoted prayers or proverbs during this process, blending faith and craft in equal measure. Once close enough, Gerard positions the skep beneath the branch. With a single sharp motion, he shakes the branch, and the cluster drops like a heavy cloth into the basket. The sound is startling, but the bees do not scatter far. Most remain with the queen, and within minutes, the hive's entrance is dark. With their small bodies moving in and out, the skep is then covered with a cloth and carried back to the yard. Once home, Gerard places it in a shaded spot beside the others, ensuring the entrance faces southeast to catch the morning sun. He will not disturb them for several days, giving the swarm time to settle. In this way, a new colony is added without anger or loss. But the work does not end here. Over the following weeks, Gerard will watch their flight paths, noting whether they favor the herbs in his garden or the flowers in the meadow. He will also make small adjustments, such as placing a shallow dish of water nearby to prevent the bees from wandering too far in search of it. It is a slow process, governed by seasons and patience. Too much interference, and the bees may leave. Too little, and they may fail to thrive. In the medieval approach, the beekeeper walks a line between guardian and guest, always mindful that the bees are free to choose their own way. As the days pass, you begin to see how swarming is not merely an event, but a turning point in the village's year. Each captured swarm promises honey for winter and wax for candles. Each lost swarm is a quiet setback, and so, when the first jars of honey from the new hive are opened months later, there is a sense of quiet gratitude, not celebration, but the satisfaction of having worked in harmony with something that cannot be commanded. Still, you cannot help but wonder, what happens when a medieval beekeeper fails to capture a swarm, and the bees choose the wild instead? Would you like to continue to section 3 of story 2? You said : next chat GPT said. Alright, here's the conclusion. With story 2, section 3 of the medieval art of keeping bees without annoying them. When a swarm escapes a beekeeper's reach, it is not gone in silence. It leaves a trace in both sound and story. It begins with the sudden stillness in the yard. A hive that once thrummed with constant motion falls oddly quiet. Then, in the distance, a faint roar, thousands of wings beating together, moving as a single body. By the time Gerard steps outside, the swarm is already a dark, shifting cloud, drifting toward the trees beyond the fields. In the medieval countryside, a swarm heading for the wild was not necessarily a disaster. It was a loss. Yes, of honey, of wax, of the investment made in tending the hive, but it was also part of the natural cycle. Wild colonies meant more bees in the area and more pollination for crops and meadows alike. Still, for a beekeeper who relied on his hives, the loss was felt. Gerard follows the swarm at a distance, moving through the damp grass until he reaches the edge of the forest. Here, the bees gather on the high branch of an oak tree out of reach. Without a ladder, ropes, and several willing helpers, there is no easy way to retrieve them. And even if he had these, climbing in heavy clothes with the weight of the skep might cause more harm than good. So he does what many beekeepers in his place would do. He marks the spot in memory. Over the years, wild colonies like this one may be visited in late summer when their combs are heavy with honey. Medieval law in some regions allowed a beekeeper to claim honey from a wild hive if it was in common land. But this was done sparingly, taking only enough to avoid weakening the colony before winter. In the meantime, he watches from below as the bees slowly disappear into the hollow of the oak. This will be their home now, warm and protected through the cold months ahead. He makes a note in his mental calendar. The oak will bloom again in spring, and with it, the colony will grow back. In the village, Gerard begins preparing his remaining hives for the change in season. He adjusts the entrances to keep out cold drafts, patches worn spots in the skeps, and checks the weight of each to ensure they have enough stores to last. The loss of a swarm is a reminder to tend all the more carefully to those that remain. As autumn turns to winter, the hives grow quiet. The bees cluster deep inside, vibrating their bodies to keep warm. In the dim light of the shed, Gerard renders wax from the last harvest into candles, their honeyed scent filling the space. These will burn in the church during the longest nights, a small glow in the darkness. By the time spring comes, the cycle will begin again. The flowers will open, the bees will fly, and the possibility of swarms will return. For Gerard, and for countless medieval beekeepers like him, this rhythm is as reliable as the tolling of the church bell. Success is measured not in control, but in balance, keeping the bees content enough to stay, yet free enough to follow their own paths. You leave Gerard's yard with a new understanding. Beekeeping in his time was not about domination, but about gentle negotiation with creatures that owed him nothing. The wax, the honey, the pollination, all of it was a gift, freely given so long as the relationship remained steady. And so, the thought lingers as you walk back along the muddy path toward the village. How many quiet partnerships like this, between human and animal, patient and reciprocal, have been lost to the faster, louder rhythms of the modern world. The sun stands high when Farrokh leads you toward the village square. From here, the presence of the Connaught is invisible. There are no exposed channels or splashing fountains. Instead, water emerges quietly into shaded courtyards, clay reservoirs, and narrow irrigation canals that snake between fields. This is the final stage of the journey, the point where months of planning, digging, and upkeep yield the single resource on which the village depends. A cluster of women gather at a rectangular stone basin beneath a canopy of woven reeds. They dip brass pots into the clear water, speaking in soft tones that mingle with the trickle from a spout. Even at the hottest hour, the water's surface gives off a faint chill, Farak gestures to a smaller channel branching away from the basin. It is lined with stones, no more than the width of your hand. This is Kabrisband, a secondary channel that carries water to the fields. The farmers use small gates made from palm wood to direct the flow. When one plot's turn has ended, the gate is shifted and the water begins its slow run toward the next. The order of watering is not left to chance. There is a schedule, an inherited arrangement, enforced not by written law, but by memory and agreement passed through generations. You walk along one of these channels. The land is bare in places, green in others. The desert's edge is always visible, reminding you that without the Qanat, none of this would exist. Farak stops to greet a farmer who is repairing a collapsed section of wall. The man uses nothing more than mud mixed with straw, pressing it into place with his hands. It will harden in the sun within an hour, ready to hold the water for another season later. In the village's shaded meeting hall, you meet the Miraba watermaster. His role is to ensure fairness in distribution, a task requiring equal measures of patience and authority. He keeps no written records. Instead, he carries in his mind the needs of each household, the planting cycles of each field. Wells' supply fell dangerously low. In such times, the village reduced its use, leaving some fields dry to ensure drinking water would last. In the worst year, he remembers, they closed the gates entirely for 3 days out of every 7, forcing people to ration. It was hard, he says, but the Qanat gave what it could. We survived because we respected its limits. As evening approaches, you return with Farak to the edge of the desert, where the first shaft you visited now stands in warm shadow. You think of the distance the water has traveled, its silent passage beneath sun-baked soil, its careful guidance by the slopes and air shafts, its guarded emergence in the heart of the village. It is not a system that calls attention to itself. There is no grand monument to the engineers who measured the angles, or the diggers who cut through hard earth in stifling heat. The Qanat was never about spectacle. It was about endurance. It was about ensuring that, in a place where heat and dryness seem unshakable, life could still root itself in the soil. You recall Farak's words from earlier. No pipes, no pumps, no noise. Yet the Qanat has something modern infrastructure, often lacks adaptability over centuries. It does not need imported materials or replacement parts from distant factories. You feel the cooling wind rising from the shaft, the same air that has traveled with the water beneath your feet. You breathe it in, carrying with you the quiet truth that some of the most remarkable achievements in human history are not the loudest. They can be forgotten, yet still endure. And you wonder, in the centuries to come, will our own methods of survival be as enduring, or will they vanish when the power switches off? The morning begins before the sun fully clears the horizon. In the desert, work starts early, not from urgency, but from the understanding that the heat will soon press down like a hand. Farak's village is quiet as you join him again, the air still cool enough to carry the smell of baking flatbread from unseen ovens. Today, he has promised to show you more than the shafts you are to descend into the Qanat itself. It is not something many outsiders are permitted to do. The tunnels are narrow, the footing uncertain, and the darkness complete once you are a few meters inside. But they are also the place where the system's secrets become visible. You reach one of the access shafts, a ring of stones surrounding a drop into shadow. Ferric has brought a rope ladder, and with a steady grip, you begin your descent. The temperature changes almost instantly as you go down. The hot, dry air of the surface is replaced by a cooler current that smells faintly of wet clay. The only sounds are your breathing and the faint echo of water somewhere below. At the bottom, you find yourself in a tunnel just wide enough to stand upright. The walls are rough but solid, carved from the packed earth centuries ago. The floor slopes almost imperceptibly downward, leading the water on its long journey from mountain to village. The stream itself runs along one side, a narrow ribbon perhaps half a meter across. Its surface is calm, the only movement the slow drift of silt and the occasional glint of reflected light from your lantern. Ferric crouches to scoop a handful. This water began its journey days ago, he says. Snow from the mountains. It melted, seeped into the ground, and found the mother well. From there, it flows here. The mother well is the deepest point of the Qanat, the place where it taps the underground water table. Everything you see, the tunnel, the shafts, the air flow exists to protect that source. As you walk, the tunnel reveals the practical genius of its builders. The floor is not perfectly smooth. Small ridges act as breaks, slowing the water just enough to prevent erosion. In some places, the ceiling dips lower, forcing you to stoop. Ferric explains that these points were carefully calculated to keep the air moving efficiently, ensuring the tunnel remains both cool and dry enough to avoid collapse. Every few hundred meters, a shaft rises toward the surface, a pale column of light faintly visible above. Some shafts bring in warm air from the desert, others cooler air from higher ground. The arrangement is not random. The builders positioned them to create a steady draft, a subtle but constant movement that keeps the water fresh. It is here, in the dim, that you realize just how much the system depends on maintenance. Sediment builds up, walls weaken, and airflow can be disrupted by fallen debris. In ancient times, and even now, whole teams of Qanat diggers and keepers would spend their lives tending these underground channels. They carried with them little more than hand tools, oil lamps, and an intimate map of every bend and slope in the dark. Ferric's own grandfather was one such keeper. He would spend weeks underground, moving from shaft to shaft, clearing blockages and repairing walls. The work was dangerous. A misstep could lead to injury far from help, and collapses were always a risk. Yet, without such care, the Qanat would soon fail, and with it, the farms and villages it sustained. After some time, you reach a section where the tunnel widens into a small chamber. The air is noticeably cooler here. This, Ferric explains, is where the tunnel passes beneath a windcatcher. Above ground, the tall brick structure funnels wind down into the chamber. The breeze skims across the water before flowing further into the tunnel, its temperature dropping as it meets the cool walls. From here, the cooled air is drawn into nearby houses, bringing relief during the hottest hours. The effect is immediate. You can feel the air shift against your skin, lighter and more refreshing than the stillness outside. It is a reminder that this system was never only about water. It was about creating an environment in which people could endure the extremes of the desert without exhausting their resources. You pause for a drink. The water is startlingly cold, almost sweet. Ferric smiles. No pipes, no pumps, no noise, he says. Only the mountain, the wind, and the patience to connect them. You think of how modern infrastructure depends on power grids, machinery, and constant fuel. Here, in the dark, the Qanat works without any of those things, sustained only by gravity and a design so well matched to the landscape that it has survived for over 2,000 years. The walk back is slow, the tunnel narrowing again, the slant of the floor barely noticeable, but always there. As you climb the shaft toward daylight, the heat meets you like a wall, and you understand why so much effort was spent to hide the water from the sun. Standing once more in the open, you look back, along the line of shafts stretching toward the mountains. They are unassuming from above, nothing that would draw the eye of a casual traveler. But now you know that beneath them runs a lifeline, cooled by wind and carved by hand, and you cannot help but wonder if such a network could be built with only the tools of its time. How many other forgotten systems lie beneath our feet, quietly working in ways we no longer recognize? The heat in the Iranian plateau is the kind that settles into the earth itself. By mid-afternoon, the sun bakes the ground until even the stones seem to breathe warmth. In such a place, finding cool water is not merely a comfort, it is a necessity, and one that ancient Persians learned to manage with a mixture of patience, engineering, and deep respect for the land's rhythms. You stand at the edge of a small village, looking out over a flat expanse, broken only by the low, round mouths of what seem to be shallow wells. They stretch in a line toward the horizon, each one ringed with stones. From a distance, they resemble beads on a string, but in truth, they are the visible openings of a Qanatan underground aqueduct system built to carry water from mountain springs to far-off fields. Your guide is Farrukh, a man whose family has tended this Qanat for as long as anyone remembers. His hands are dusty, his eyes used to peering into darkness. As he walks, he gestures to the line of well mouths. These are not for drawing water, he says. They are for air. The idea is deceptively simple. A Qanat begins high in the mountains, where a spring feeds a gently sloping tunnel dug deep beneath the surface. Gravity carries the water downward, away from the heat, toward the places where people live and farm. But the tunnels are not sealed. They are punctuated at intervals by these vertical shafts, which allow workers to enter for maintenance. Crucially, allow air to flow through. It is here that the Persians' understanding of wind comes into play. In certain seasons, the prevailing breezes sweep across the land and into these shafts, drawing cooler air into the tunnels. The movement of air helps keep the water temperature low, slowing evaporation and preventing the growth of algae. Farrukh leads you to the first shaft. The opening is little more than a meter across, its rim worn smooth by centuries of hands and ropes. You lean over and feel the faint draft rising from below. It is cooler than the air above, carrying with it the mineral scent of wet earth. This is the Qanat's breath, the invisible work of wind passing over distant openings and setting a slow circulation in motion. The construction of such a system required not only knowledge of engineering, but remarkable endurance. Workers would dig the tunnels by hand, starting from both the mountain source and the intended outlet, meeting somewhere in between. Each shaft you see marks a stage in that work, a place where soil was hauled up and air was allowed to enter. In some cases, the qanats stretched for kilometers, quiet rivers flowing in darkness. As you walk along the line of shafts, Farrokh explains how these wind-assisted tunnels were paired with badgers or wind catchers. In certain towns, tall, narrow towers were built to trap the wind and funnel it downward into homes and cisterns. When connected to a qanat, the effect was astonishing. Hot desert air was cooled as it passed over the underground water, creating a natural form of air conditioning centuries before the modern kind. In Yazd, a city famous for its wind catchers, some houses still use this principle. The wind enters through high slits, travels down a shaft, sweeps over a pool fed by the qanat, and emerges into the living space, cooler and lighter. In the driest heat, this could mean a difference of 10 or even 15 degrees, small miracle achieved without a single moving part. But the qanat is not just a feat of cooling, it is a lifeline. In summer, when surface wells run dry, the underground channels continue to deliver water drawn from distant snowmelt. Fields of barley and pomegranate orchards survive because of these hidden rivers. Villages plan their planting schedules according to the flow, and disputes over water are settled with careful measurement, often by elders who have memorized the timings of every qanat in the region. By now, the sun is lowering toward the hills, casting the shafts in long shadows. Farrokh kneels to drop a small pebble into one of them. It clicks against the sides, bounces, and after several seconds, you hear the soft splash below. That, he says, is cold water, even now. You cannot see it, but you imagine the tunnel stretching away into darkness, the wind sliding along its walls, the slow movement of water guided by nothing more than slope and patience. As you turn back toward the village, the question lingers. If the qanat can carry coolness and life across miles of desert, what other invisible systems might have once sustained entire civilizations without leaving more than a trace on the surface? The question of poor harvests is one the monks never take lightly. As you return to the granary on a wind-swept autumn afternoon, Brother Anselm is seated at his high stool, the ledger before him, but this time his brow is furrowed. The inkpot sits untouched, as if he is weighing what words to write. When the harvest fails, the rhythm of the monastery changes. The slow, deliberate turning of grain is replaced by careful rationing. The granary's great wooden doors remain locked for most of the day, opened only when a precise measure of grain is to be removed. Instead of bringing sacks forward for repacking, the monks carry smaller baskets to the cloister kitchens, each portion weighed on the heavy iron scales that rest on the counter like a judge's gavel. You watch as Anselm, joined by the abbeys, Prior inspects the remaining sacks. Some are pulled aside. These are the poorer quality grains, to be ground into coarse flour for the monks themselves. The better sacks, clean and free of pests, are reserved for the infirmary and for guests, whose treatment is a reflection of the monastery's reputation. In years of shortage, every handful is counted twice. The parchment tags are updated with red ink to mark in usum rationis, for rationed use. The entries in the ledger grow shorter but denser, each line crammed with figures, amounts taken, dates, purposes, and the initials of the monk responsible. It is a record not just of supplies but of trust, For no one monk may remove grain without the knowledge of another. Outside the granary, the fields may lie bare, but the work within continues. Some monks are sent to neighboring villages to barter for surplus, offering honey from the abbey's hives or wool from its sheep in exchange for barley or rye. Others tend to the monastery's kitchen gardens, knowing that every onion and carrot grown will ease the strain on the dwindling grain supply. And yet, despite the scarcity, there is no sense of panic. The monastery has survived such years before. The memory of past shortages is written not just in ledgers, but in the habits of the monks themselves, never wasting, never taking more than is needed. One evening, as the winter wind rattles the shutters, Anselm speaks quietly to you while recording the day's ration in the ledger. The measure of a granary, he says, is not how full it is in autumn, but whether it lasts until spring. He smiles faintly, dipping his quill into the ink, and writes the numbers as steadily as if they were the beads of a rosary. By late spring, the shortage begins to ease. A merchant arrives with sacks from a distant estate, and the monks carry them in with a mix of relief and caution. Anselm's entries grow longer again, his pen moving with a rhythm that signals the return of abundance. The cycle has turned, as it always does, and in the cool stillness of the granary, among the scent of wood and grain, the ledgers stand on their shelves, ready to record the next year's yield, whether full or lean. It leaves you with a quiet thought in the grand sweep of history. Is it the victories we remember, or the ledgers that kept us alive through the years no one sings about? You return to the granary later in the day, when the monks have gathered after midday prayers to move grain from one section to another. The sunlight outside is bright and golden, but in here the light comes through small, narrow windows slanted to keep the direct heat away from the grain. Dust motes drift lazily in the beams, swirling each time a sack is lifted. Brother Anselm is now joined by two younger monks, Brother Peter and Brother Matthias. Their movements are slow but coordinated, practiced over many seasons. They work in near silence, except for the occasional grunt when a sack shifts unexpectedly, or the muted thump when it's set down again. The process begins with an inspection of the ledger. Anselm runs his finger down the columns, nods once, and then signals for a sack of rye to be brought forward. The rye, stored since late summer, is due for turning, a process in which the contents of each sack are emptied, checked, and repacked to prevent settling or spoilage. You watch as the sack is untied and its mouth carefully rolled open. The rye flows out in a slow cascade into a large wooden trough. The smell is earthy, faintly sweet, and somehow comforting. Anselm bends low, running his fingers through the grain to check for dampness or hidden pests. Any damaged kernels are picked out by hand, one by one. This is not speed work. It is deliberate, methodical, and, to an outsider, perhaps unbearably slow. Once satisfied, they refill the sack, taking care not to overpack it. The hemp rope is wound in a particular knot, one every monk here knows and could identify by touch alone. A tag of parchment is tied to the rope with the date of repacking, the initials of the monk who performed it, and a brief note on the condition. The sack is then recorded in the ledger again, replacing its old entry with the new details. This turning is done for every single sack of grain at least once during the storage season. If the monastery is well supplied, the work can take weeks. In times of poor harvest, it takes far less, but those seasons bring a different kind of worry. Brother Peter, noticing your interest, explains that their method of timekeeping for such work relies not on bells alone, but on the daily rhythm of the sun's position through the small windows. When the light strikes a particular crack in the far wall, they know it is time to begin turning grain in a certain section. It's an imprecise but dependable system, one that works year after year without the aid of clocks. Beyond the walls of the granary, the monastery fields stretch toward the horizon. Much of the grain stored here was grown within sight of these walls, tended by the same hands that now lift and sort the sacks. The cycle is complete. The monks sow, harvest, store, and eventually consume the very grain they have watched grow from seed. Anselm's role, though it may seem quiet and unremarkable, is one of the most important in the monastery. A feast day can be joyous, but only if there is enough bread to serve. A guest can be welcomed warmly, but only if there is grain for the porridge. And the prayers of winter mornings can be said in comfort only if the salarious records have ensured that the stores will last until spring, by the time the turning is complete for the day. The sun outside has begun to soften. The monks brush dust from their robes, clean the tools, and close the shutters. The granary is left in cool shadow, its silence returning as they file out. Yet, as you watch Anselm make his final notations in the ledger, you cannot help but wonder what happens in years when the harvest fails and there is not enough grain to record. The morning begins not with bells for prayer, but with the scraping sound of wooden shutters being opened in the monastery granary. You step inside, and the air is heavy with the dry scent of stored grain, a faint sweetness layered with the dusty aroma of old wood. The granary is not a single room, but a long, narrow hall divided into compartments. Each compartment holds a different harvest. Sacks of barley stacked in neat columns, bins of rye with their surfaces smoothed flat, crates of millet tied shut with twisted hemp rope. In the far corner, a small door leads to a cooler chamber where peas and lentils are kept away from the heat of the sun. Brother Anselm, the monastery's appointed salarius, greets you with a nod. His robe is marked with pale dust where he has brushed against the sacks. His duties begin well before the other brothers rise for morning prayers, for the granary's records must be kept up to date each day. In a community that depends on stored food to carry them through the winter, nothing is left to chance, not even a handful of missing grain. You follow him to a wooden table on which lies an open ledger. The parchment pages are ruled with careful lines, each column headed with black ink in an even hand. Type, quantity, location, date, stored, condition. Brother Anselm dips a quill into the inkwell, recording the results of the morning's inspection. He works with slow precision, pausing often to blow gently on the ink so it will dry without smudging. As he writes, he speaks in a low voice, explaining that grain is measured not by weight but by volume. Large wooden bushel baskets, each carved with a shallow groove to mark the correct fill, are the monastery's standard. To ensure no dispute arises, each basket is tested at the end of every summer using a set of iron weights in the abbots. Keeping the cataloging is as much about location as quantity. A sack of barley recorded in the ledger is also assigned a precise place in the granary, third row, second stack from the west wall, upper tier. This means that when a brother comes to retrieve grain for baking or brewing, there is no confusion and no time wasted searching. As you walk the length of the granary with Anselm, he stops frequently to inspect the sacks. His eyes are searching for signs of spoilage, a patch of mold where moisture has seeped in, a small tear that might invite pests. If a problem is found, the sack is moved at once to a separate storeroom for sorting and salvage. Grain that cannot be saved is recorded as lost, though even this loss is tallied carefully. For every missing measure must be explained at the year's end, outside the granary. The monastery garden is still glistening with morning dew, but here inside, time feels slow and deliberate. The air is still, and every sound footsteps on the planks, the creak of a rope, the rustle of grains muted by the thick stone walls. You begin to understand that the work here is not just physical, but almost ritual in its precision. Before you leave, Anselm shows you a smaller ledger, one kept for emergencies. In it, he has copied, in the same careful script, the total amount of grain needed for the monastery to survive through the lean months, broken down by week. The figures are not guesses. They are based on decades of observation, with allowances for fasting periods, feast days, and the arrival of travelers seeking shelter. The brothers may live a life of prayer and contemplation, but their survival rests upon the quiet arithmetic of the granary. Even the smallest error could mean the difference between plenty and hunger. And as you step outside, you find yourself wondering, in a world without clocks, how did these monks keep time so precisely in the flow of grain? You wake before dawn, the sky just beginning to fade from black to the faintest gray. In the stillness, the handlers are already moving, tightening straps and securing the mail sacks for another day's travel. The camels chew lazily at bundles of dry fodder, their jaws moving in slow, deliberate circles. Today's leg will take the caravan to Tindouf, the most distant point of this route, where letters and goods will be exchanged for items traveling back toward the coast. For the handlers, this is the halfway point in their circuita. Pause before retracing the desert's length in reverse, dot as the sun climbs. You notice that the terrain changes. The dunes give way to long stretches of gravel plain, where the sound of hooves striking stone replaces the soft sigh of sand. The heat rises quickly here, shimmering on the horizon. The camels continue unhurried, their steady breathing the only rhythm you hear. By midday. The caravan stops at a landmark as unremarkable as it is essential, a solitary tamarisk tree, its thin branches clinging stubbornly to life in the dry air. It is the only shade for many miles. Beneath its shadow, the handlers share a pot of millet porridge and pour tea brewed strong and sweet. Each sip seems to sharpen the mind just enough for the long road ahead. Arriving in Tittendorf, you see a settlement that is both crossroads and resting place. Traders, nomads, and travelers gather here to exchange news, barter goods, and wait for the next caravan headed in their direction. The postal handlers enter a low mud brick building where a clerk, one of the few in this network, who writes down what he receives, records the incoming mail. The letter to the keeper of the wells is handed over without ceremony. It joins a pile of other correspondence, some of which may wait days or weeks before being delivered. In this system, urgency is a relative thing. What matters most is that the chain of hands never breaks from sender to receiver, no matter how long it takes. You spend the evening watching the settlements, small market, dates, salt, cloth, and goat cheese change hands in quiet negotiations. The pace is unhurried, as if every person knows they have the time they need. In the morning, the caravan will turn back toward the coast, retracing its steps with another set of letters tied carefully in its bags. You imagine each one messages of business, affection, or obligation making its way across the vast, indifferent desert, carried by the soft, deliberate steps of camels who have no concept of deadlines. As you lie awake, you wonder, in a world that now measures delivery in hours, what would it feel like to wait months and find the waiting perfectly ordinary? The caravan has been on the move for 2 days now. At night, the desert cools enough for the handlers to sleep wrapped in wool blankets, their camels resting nearby in a tight circle. The camels kneel in the sand, their long necks folding down like cranes settling on a lake. Occasionally, one will groan softly, the sound carrying across the stillness. You walk among them in the early dawn, noting the mail sacks still secured beneath the saddles. The leather is cracked from sun and wind, but it holds fast. Inside are letters written in languages and scripts as varied as the desert peoples themselves: Zarabic, Tamashek, Hassania, and even the occasional French merchant's invoice. Some bear careful seals of wax. Others are tied shut with plain string. By mid-morning, the caravan reaches a small cluster of acacia trees, marking a shallow well. Here, the camels kneel again, and water is drawn up in goatskin buckets. Every drop counts. The handlers are deliberate water for the camels first, then for themselves. A single camel can drink up to 30 liters in one sitting, and each one is given the chance before the journey continues. At the well, you meet a messenger traveling in the opposite direction. His camel bears a single bag, much lighter than those of your caravan. The two handlers exchange greetings and a few small parcels, checking each item against their mental inventory. In this system, the transfer of mail does not require paperwork, only a memory trusted enough to carry the details from one person to the next. Sometimes the routes are determined as much by politics as geography. A tribal leader may demand that the caravan pass through his territory in exchange for safe passage. A sudden dispute between neighboring clans might close an established path entirely. The postal handlers are adept at adjusting, rerouting across unfamiliar stretches of desert, guided by the stars at night and the shape of dunes by day. As the sun climbs higher, the caravan moves into the long hours of heat when travel slows to conserve strength. The camel's gait remains steady, each step pressing into the sand with a faint sighing sound. The desert smells faintly of dust and dry grass. There is no other scent to distract you. The handlers talk little during this part of the day. Conversation uses energy, and the desert rewards silence. Instead, you begin to notice the subtler forms of communication, the tilt of a head to signal a turn in the path, the way a camel's ear twitches in response to a handler's presence, the shared understanding that comes from months on the road together. When the sun begins to drop toward the horizon, the caravan reaches another way station, a low wall surrounding a shaded courtyard, much like the one you departed from. The station master here greets the handlers, counting sacks and noting the condition of the seals. A few letters are removed from the load, destined for nearby settlements, while others are added. Their journey only just beginning. You are given a place to sleep on a raised platform, the night air cooling quickly after the heat of the day. From this height, you can see the desert stretching endlessly in all directions, and the faint glimmer of another caravan's campfire many miles away. Somewhere among the sacks in the courtyard is the letter to the keeper of the wells at Tindouf. You find yourself wondering again if it will reach him in time, more if time even matters. Here, in a place where news travels no faster than a camel's stride. And then you ask yourself, when a postal route has no fixed timetable, does the idea of late even exist? If you stand on the edge of the desert in the early morning, before the sun begins to burn the sand into a shimmering mirage, you might hear the first low grumble of the postal camels preparing for the day's journey. These are not racing camels, nor beasts of pageantry. They are the quiet, unhurried workers of the Sahara, tasked with carrying letters, ledgers, and sometimes small parcels between distant oases and trading posts. Their pace is not determined by urgency, but by the rhythm of the desert itself, slow, steady, and deliberate. You find yourself at a way station on the edge of the Saoura Valley in what is now southwestern Algeria. The year is somewhere in the late 18th century, though you suspect this way of moving the mail had been in place for generations before that. The station is a squat building of mud brick, its walls thick enough to keep out the heat, with a shaded courtyard where the camels rest. Inside, the station master sits on a reed mat, a ledger before him. His job is to record every letter that passes through: the sender, the recipient, the origin, the destination. The writing is careful, each Arabic script character flowing into the next like the tracks of an ant across the sand. The postal network here is not centralized in the way a European mail system might be. Instead, it relies on a chain of trust among traders, local governors, and desert guides. Letters are handed from one camel caravan to another at oases, each leg of the journey determined not by maps, but by memory and the knowledge of water sources. The camels themselves are fitted with light wooden saddles, under which sacks of mail are strapped. The weight is minimal. Most letters are written on thin sheets of paper or parchment, but the distance they must travel makes the work arduous. A single leg between oases might take 3 to 5 days, with travel restricted to the cooler hours of morning and late afternoon in the station yard. The camel handlers prepare their animals in silence. Water skins are filled, sacks are counted, and a final tally is made. The desert is patient, but it is also unforgiving. No one leaves without ensuring every drop of water and every scrap of dried dates is accounted for. As the caravan departs, the pace is almost hypnotic. The camels' padded feet leave soft impressions in the sand that vanish almost as soon as they're made. The handlers walk alongside, their faces wrapped in cloth to shield them from the wind, speaking in low tones only when necessary. You think of the letters inside those sacks, slow-moving words, carrying news that may already be weeks old when they arrive. A birth announced in spring might not be known in the next town until midsummer. A request for goods might reach its destination long after the caravan carrying them has already passed. And yet, in this world, such delays are not frustrations, but facts of life. One letter in particular catches your attention as the station master logs it, a folded sheet addressed to the keeper of the wells at Tindo. Its contents are unknown to you, but you wonder how many hands it will pass through before it finds its way to the keeper. Will he even be there when it arrives? Or will the message end its journey in another ledger, recorded but never read? You watch the camels disappear into the pale gold horizon, their silhouettes shrinking until they merge with the shifting line where earth meets sky. In the desert, speed is meaningless, only endurance matters, and you are left wondering when a letter takes months to arrive. Does the meaning of the message change by the time it is read? And so, the night passes over Timbuktu. The last lamp is snuffed out, and the scribes fold their hands, leaving the manuscripts in neat, patient stacks. Outside, the desert is still. The constellations drift slowly westward, marking the quiet hours until dawn. In the morning, there will be more pages to sort, more words to guard, more secrets to tuck away in the shadows of these walls. But for now, all is silence, just the cool breath of the desert and the endless glitter of the sky. Sleep well, as the stars keep watch, just as they always have.